supreme wisdom upon our activities. Help us to speak our minds clearly. Help us to listen to each other, respect each other, love each other so that we are included to those persons. Help us to focus our minds and hearts about to learn. Activities help us to guide us as we discover more about the world around us. Amen. Before we start our general lecture, I will guide all of us to sing and to stand first. Our activities about our national anthem, Indonesia Raya. Before we start our general lecture, I will guide all of us to sing. Thank you. You may sit. Before we start our general lecture, our head of postgraduate program in communication science, Mrs. Maulina Pia Wulandari, will deliver some greeting for all of us. To Ma'am Pia, the time and place is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, everybody. The honorable guest, Professor Lauren Peterson, the honorable guest, Dr. Bambang Dwi Prasetyo as Vice Dean of Students Affairs and Alumni and Entrepreneurship of Faculty Social Science and Political Science, University of Brawijaya, and honorable guest, Professor Ricky Third Abalina from Fayez University, Philippines, and all participants who attend or joining the international guest lecture this morning. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude as the head of postgraduate program in communication science, Faculty Social Science and Political Science, University of Brawijaya, for the time for Professor Lauren who come to University Brawijaya and sharing her experience and her knowledge, especially in Asian perspective in terms of communication. We focus now today, we will discuss about multicultural communication in the perspective of Asia. Of course, we are very proud that Professor Lauren want to spend her busy time during her visit in Indonesia. And of course, we also very grateful for her visit because we can learn so much from her, the importance of Asian perspective in many studies, especially in communication studies. So hopefully this international guest lecture will enrich our knowledge regarding Asian perspective, especially in multicultural communication studies. So we can we'll be proud that we don't have to worry about we've been what is that? I mean powered by the Western perspective that usually we learn from our class uh, in bachelor degree, in postgraduate degree. So now we can understand more about the role of Asian perspective in the development of communication study. Again, thank you so much for joining the international guest lecture. I hope you enjoy the uh, this lecture. And of course, if you have any question or anything that you can ask, you can share your opinion in your chat box, and then the moderator will help you to send the message to Professor Lauren. Thank you very much and have a nice day. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
All right, thank you, Mrs. Pia. Now it's time for Dr. Bambang as the third Vice Dean of the Faculty of Social and Political Science to deliver some greetings for all of us. To meet Dr. Bambang, the time and place is yours.
Oke, terima kasih. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi, salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan. Yang terhormat atau yang saya hormati, the Honorable Prof. Lauren Peterson from School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, Washington. Welcome to Social and Politics Universitas of Brawijaya, Department Communication, Program Studi Magister Communication. Yeah, okay. Yang saya hormati juga yang saya banggakan, Ibu Ketua Program Studi Magister S2 Ilmu Komunikasi, Bu Maulina Pia Wulandari PhD. Yang saya hormati Bapak Ibu audiens yang hadir pada seminar internasional yang bertemakan perspektif Asia dalam kajian komunikasi antar budaya. Dalam sambutan ini saya gunakan bahasa Indonesia ya, karena saya lihat audiennya banyak dari teman-teman di Indonesia. Ada satu yang dari Filipina tadi, Prof. Ricky. Welcome Prof. Ricky from Filipina. Good mornings. I am Bambang Dwi Prastyo. Yes. Vice Student Affairs, Entrepreneur and Alumni from Social and Politics Universitas Brawijaya. Pertama-tama saya mengucapkan selamat pada Ibu Pia sebagai Ketua Program Studi Magister Ilmu Komunikasi yang pada pagi hari ini mengadakan acara yang sangat luar biasa, mengadakan kegiatan yang berhubungan dengan kajian perspektif Asia dalam komunikasi antar budaya. Ini adalah hal yang sangat penting, isu-isu yang terkait dengan komunikasi antar budaya, karena kita tahu bahwa interaksi antar manusia di dunia ini ya, tidak bisa dielakkan dan tidak bisa hindari lagi, ya, apalagi dalam konteks teknologi yang seperti ini. Proses interaksi, pertemuan itu pasti akan banyak menimbulkan satu ekses masalah, dan kadang-kadang dalam konteks komunikasi akan menimbulkan pemahaman yang berbeda-beda terhadap konteks situasi dan sosial budaya yang ditemui orang-orang yang berinteraksi di situasi yang berbeda-beda itu. Oleh karena itu, ini adalah satu hal yang sangat baik untuk dilakukan, mengkaji tentang persoalan komunikasi antar budaya dari perspektif Asia. Perlu saya informasikan bahwa di fakultas kami, terutama di Departemen Komunikasi, itu ada kajian yang secara spesifik memang membahas mengenai isu-isu komunikasi antar budaya. Dan perspektif Asia itu juga menjadi fokus di dalam kajian. Bahkan ada satu mata kuliah yang sudah kami kemas di dalam kajian ilmu komunikasi. Oleh karena itu, tentu dengan aktivitas seminar internasional yang dihadiri oleh Prof. Lawrence Peterson sebagai narasumber pada pagi hari ini akan memberikan satu impact yang sangat luar biasa bagi kita semua. Itu yang bisa kami sampaikan. Mudah-mudahan acara ini bisa berjalan lancar dan sukses dan membawa kebermanfaatan bagi kita semua. Dengan ucapan Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, acara internasional guest lecture with Prof. Lawrence Peterson as speaker from School of International Studies, Johns Hopkins University, saya nyatakan dibuka. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
All right, thank you, Dr. Bambang, for the greetings. Before we jump into the lecture with Professor Lorraine, I will introduce you about her. So Professor Lorraine Peterson is a research associate with the European Research Council project specializing in Southeast Asia, particularly Vietnam and Cambodia. She's also a professor at School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C. She earned a PhD degree in history from Yale University and Master of Arts in Asian Studies from Cornell University. She has lived and worked extensively in Southeast Asia for over 25 years, including 3 years working for CARE International and the United Nations in Cambodia. She has been leading tours for Distant Horizons for over 20 years to over 10 different countries. This lecture will be moderated by Mr. Abdul Hair. So me as Master of Ceremony will give the time and place to Mr. Hair. The time and place is yours, Mr. Hair, as well as Professor Lorraine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mas Bima. Good morning, Prof. Lorraine. Good morning, Pak Bambang. Good morning, Bu Pia. Good morning, everyone. I would like to introduce myself. I am Abdul Hair, junior lecturer at the Department of Communication Studies at Brawijaya University, and I will be your moderator for this international general lecture. Since 2015, Department of Communication Studies has developed a distinctive course, namely Communication Perspective of Indonesia and Asia. And our department is the only department in Indonesian universities that has this course. Our mission to develop this course is not to reject Western perspective and theories, but to make a critical dialogue with Western perspective. So in this general lecture, we are going to talk about Asian perspective in the multicultural communication studies. Thank you, Prof. Lorraine Peterson, for being here today. We are eager to hear your insight and expertise. To Professor Peterson, time and place is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for such a warm welcome to come back to Brawijaya, which I always love to come to when I'm in Indonesia. So thank you very much for this kind invitation to come and talk today. My background, as you heard from my bio, is in history and literature and language as opposed to communication studies. So I'm looking forward to also learning from you today about your thoughts on how we can improve inter-Asian communication. What I can bring to you today is some insights into thinking about Southeast Asia as a region and how the cultures and communication strategies of the countries of ASEAN should work together in order to promote a truly Southeast Asian future together. So my background is in Vietnam and Cambodia. It's not in Indonesia. I don't speak Indonesian. I'm not an expert on Indonesia. I have taught Indonesian history and literature for essentially 25 years now, but I'm not an expert as such on Indonesia. I would consider myself to be an expert on the countries of former French Indochina, namely Vietnam and Cambodia. In terms of my bio, which was very kindly summarized for you at the beginning of my talk, I currently teach Southeast Asian international relations at Johns Hopkins University's School for International and Advanced Studies. This is a campus of Johns Hopkins University in the Washington, D.C. area. I only teach master's students and PhD students, and I have many students from Indonesia who actually are able to come and study with me, which is wonderful. So I have students from here and from other parts of Southeast Asia. So there I teach history and international relations. I've also worked for different European Research Council projects in the region, and I'm currently working on one with the University of Leicester, which is based in Leicester in the United Kingdom, not far from Birmingham, for those of you familiar with the United Kingdom. And there, that project is funded by the Lieberham Trust, which is a trust in the UK that funds a lot of different interesting projects. So I'm actually here after doing some work in Malaysia, which was funded by the Lieberham Trust and the University of Leicester. So I'd also like to acknowledge their sponsorship of this trip to Southeast Asia this summer. So that's a little bit about my background, and what I hope to be able to share with you today is to think more about ASEAN as a region and how communication strategies within this region can be improved. So let me go ahead and start with some remarks. We'll just start on the first slide for the moment. Thanks, just the title page. So the past 40 years have witnessed a rapid development of communication studies in Asia, which have reached a certain level of maturity. Asia's dramatic economic growth and enormous societal transformations create diverse venues for communication research and also a way to better understand communication between the ASEAN countries. Although communication studies emerge from Western cultural perspectives, as we've already acknowledged this morning, there have been many shifts towards a better understanding of the ideas of Asian countries within the last 15 years of research. Some scholars would argue that studies of Asian communication have focused on European intellectual traditions and therefore pay little attention to the cultural agency of Asians in linguistics, religious, philosophical, and the historical contexts of Asia, so important to think about when we think about communication strategies. However, I would argue this has really shifted in the last 15 years. I think people now really focus on cultural critiques of Asian communication theory. But what Asia are we talking about? What themes unite Asian cultural studies? Asia is a very broad region. Today, I'm really going to focus on Southeast Asia, primarily the countries of ASEAN. And as you can see in my title slide, I'm going to talk about Asian perspectives in the plural, because there's not one perspective. With such a vast diversity in geography, cultures, and religions, it is extremely risky to generalize that there's one Asian communication or that all Asian countries have the same values, which is obviously not accurate. Many scholars would say that Asian countries share some unique values, which means that communication can be studied as Asia-centric, but I would argue against this, as distinct differences do exist, and it's important for us to understand the ways in which Asian countries vary and their cultures vary. Indeed, as we think about globalization and localization in Asian communication theory, it's very important to think about Asian communication paradigms. So in this talk, I will attempt to encapsulate the most salient and intriguing advances of thinking about how we can talk about Asian cultural, historical, philosophical, religious, and social contexts as regards communication strategies, focusing on my two sites of research, Vietnam and Cambodia, primarily Vietnam. Asian experience enables scholars to understand what some of this communication can mean within the so-called global Asian era. However, I still think it's important to really look at cultural difference within the region itself. As I mentioned, my background is the study of the literatures and languages of the countries of former French Indochina. For many years in the Department of Asian Studies at Cornell University, I taught primarily American undergraduates about the literatures and languages of the region of Southeast Asia. One thing I was struck by as I came to work in Southeast Asia over the years to lecture at universities here in Malang, in Phnom Penh, in Hanoi, in Ho Chi Minh City, is the extent to which students in the region know very little about the languages, literatures, and communication strategies of the other countries of ASEAN. This means that communication between ASEAN is much harder at times than people would hope for because of this lack of knowledge. So how can the study of Southeast Asian languages and literary traditions better integrate communication within the countries of ASEAN? A very important topic, especially for Indonesia to think of as it chairs ASEAN and it sees itself as the vanguard of the progress of all of Southeast Asia throughout the world. I often tell my students, all eyes are on Indonesia, because Indonesia, as the biggest and eventually will be the most economically powerful country in Southeast Asia without a doubt, has to think about how it leads itself within ASEAN, and the idea of how it communicates to its fellow partners within ASEAN is absolutely fundamental to this. Historically colonized by all the major world powers, encountering all the major world religions, Southeast Asia is a region embodying a dizzying political, cultural, religious, and linguistic diversity. It has undergone a staggering economic and societal transformation in the last 20 years. At this historical moment, it lies at the center of the global shift to the Asia-Pacific as the region becomes increasingly economically powerful and interconnected. Its youthful, media-savvy populations embrace the digital age as the Southeast Asian nations create both shared and unique responses to challenges posed by global flows, urbanization, and technology. But how can these countries become more interwoven with greater mutual understanding? So I would argue that although once considered an artificially constructed object of study, Southeast Asia today is more societally and economically interwoven than ever before. The rise of different kinds of projects within Southeast Asia, it means that the region is progressively linked by business networks, trade relationships, migration, shared resources. So increasing ASEAN regional economic integration and cooperation and its proposed economic integration makes this a strategic moment at which to rethink how this increasingly interlinked and powerful region of the world is best studied. Communication strategies lie at the heart of this, and to assume that just because ASEAN countries are all part of Southeast Asia. They can communicate well with each other would be a very false way of thinking. At a roundtable discussion on the future and shape of Southeast Asian studies organized by the Southeast Asian Regional Exchange at Bangkok in June 2013, Indonesian scholars argued that Southeast Asian studies was a baggage of colonial construct. I'm very glad that in your introductory remarks this morning, you mentioned the idea that we still have to think of Western theories of communication and understand from Western scholarship. Because I think sometimes in an attempt to decenter the West, we forget that we've learned a lot from Western communication strategies. And the best way forward is to integrate Western communication strategies and more localized communication strategies. I think that that is very important. Although there is a call within the field of media and communication studies to give further space and visibility to scholarship that advances decolonial and non-Western perspectives, I think that's a very good idea. Through a reflective and historically ground effort, I think it's able to illuminate both Western theories and contemporary Asian communication theories in a way that will shape a more global and integrated Asian future. When scholars have wondered previously why Southeast Asian communication studies have not progressed more, some of the oft-cited reasons contributing to this is that early centers of teaching Southeast Asian communications were located in Europe, the US, and Australia, and that most of the scholars teaching and researching Southeast Asian studies are So I feel like research on the ASEAN and ASEAN community has helped to serve and strengthen a sense of connectedness among the countries themselves without necessarily relying on the way in which this area has been constructed from Western perspectives and communication theories. The earliest program looking at Southeast Asian communication studies was the University of Malaya in 1979. And since then, we have seen a growth in the way in which Southeast Asian languages and studies have been integrated into the curriculum of many Southeast Asian countries. However, it is also true that if we look at how Southeast Asian languages are being taught in other countries in Southeast Asia, it is often a shockingly low number. If, for example, we take the University of Indonesia as an example, it teaches Korean, Dutch, Arabic, Chinese, English, Japanese, German, and French. Another example closer to home are the languages that are taught here at Brawijaya: English, French, Japanese, and Mandarin. Whereas Vietnamese, whereas Thai, where are some of the other very important Southeast Asian languages? I find it quite amazing that they don't teach any Southeast Asian languages, because without a solid grounding in other Southeast Asian languages, how can the ASEAN countries understand and communicate with each other? I know what you're going to say to me. Everyone's going to speak English, or everyone now is studying English or Chinese. However, in terms of a full literary and cultural understanding of the fellow members of ASEAN, it seems very necessary to understand the language and culture of those countries. For 1 minute, let's take an example from a country in which I've done extensive work, Vietnam. With Indonesian taught in state universities throughout the country, you might be surprised to learn that the second official language of Ho Chi Minh City for the last 15 years has been Indonesian, because in Vietnam, people understand that the growth, the joint growth of this region relies on people understanding each other within ASEAN. So you might say, people speak English, why does it matter? Why does it matter if we speak Vietnamese? Why does it matter if people can speak Indonesian? so much about a culture and a way to communicate with culture is embedded in its language, its allusions, its metaphors, how people address each other. You know, when I tell people about my years of living in Cambodia and Vietnam, they're so surprised to learn that I did not refer to myself as I during my whole stay. I would refer to myself as younger sister, older sister, niece, aunt to young children. I would refer to myself relationally. That's a very, very obvious point, right? To people in Scotland, they find this amazing because no one refers to themselves as a relation to someone else. That's a very small example, right, of how language reflects culture. That instantly tells me that family is important, the structure of family is important. Therefore, when I'm thinking about communicating with a country that uses pronouns in that way, I'm going to be thinking differently than an individualistic country like the US, where I is how you would always refer to yourself. So that is just one example of how important it is. So as I said, an obvious argument would be to say that Indonesia, as the largest country in Southeast Asia with the largest population, does not need to learn about the languages and cultures of the other countries of the region. However, if Indonesia wants to see itself as the vanguard of ASEAN, as the central country throughout within the ASEAN configuration, it's very important that it shows itself to be integrating linguistically and culturally with other countries throughout the region. And I think it's also true to say, and please feel free to argue with me about this, that the resources and structure of many Indonesian universities still reflect the colonial period. Arguably, some of the ways in which languages and literatures are structured even today in Indonesian institutions reflect the Dutch colonial period, with more of an emphasis on, say, European languages, as opposed to languages within the region in which you are situated. So one thing I would like to do with a few slides is to talk a little bit about the cultural differences, some cultural differences that you might find interesting between Indonesia and Vietnam, and also talk a little bit about how Asian values has been incorporated into communication strategies within Southeast Asia and some of the problems that I see with it. So let me just turn to my PowerPoint. And I'm going to move forward. If we could move to the next slide, please. I'll see if this works. I've got my handy, thank you. So here, of course, are the countries of Southeast Asia, and you can see them all listed here. When we think about Indonesia within this configuration of countries, right, you have to also think about how the different colonial powers that were involved in each of these countries may have affected some of the ways in which culture and language are today. So one of the most interesting things about the region in which you live is that not only do we have all of the different religions of the world present within the boundaries of Southeast Asia, we also have all of the countries, we have countries colonized by all of the colonial powers throughout the world. So let's move to the next slide and talk about collective linkages in some of the ways of, sorry, that might be me. It worked, wonderful. I always love it when things work. Okay, so collective linkages is what I've called this. So if we think about some of the ways in which Southeast Asian culture has arisen, oral traditions have been very important. So the mouse deer is a beloved creature in Indonesia. And I have read I've read political science documents that refer to the mouse deer, right? I've heard kind of analogies of Indonesia can think of itself as the mouse deer, and other people are like, what's a mouse deer? What does that mean, right? There's one example of something that's culturally specific to a country in Southeast Asia that could be used as a way in which to express a larger idea that is actually not appropriate for other parts of Southeast Asia. So some things do not travel. Origin myths, the famous watermelon myth from Vietnam. If a Vietnamese person was talking to you and referred to the watermelon myth, what would you say? Watermelon myth? Do you like watermelons? You wouldn't know, right? And when people are trying to reach out to an audience to understand things, they use analogies. I do it, right? So I'm not going to tell you the watermelon myth. Maybe you'd like to go and look it up. That's one example. Languages and cultures talk in shorthand because they're talking to an audience that understands what that means. And if you want to be part of the ASEAN community and understand other Asian perspectives, then you have to understand what other people, the analogies, the metaphors, the allusions, the folk tales that people will draw on. So if we move to some of these other linkages, right? We have the ways inscriptions. That is actually a unifying way in which Southeast Asian countries encountered Hinduism. That's a link. That's a cultural link. That's a bridge between a country like Indonesia and mainland Southeast Asia. Religious texts and tales. Here we come to my favorite, the Ramayana, right? There's one that could be referred to. That's something that is shared throughout Southeast Asia. As one example, colonialism. Colonialism introduced modern fiction, and that is also true of Southeast Asia. So when people talk in an Southeast Asian context, that is something that people can understand throughout the different Southeast Asian countries. So we now have a gratuitous picture of the Ramayana just because I love the Ramayana so much. But this is a text that is drawn throughout Southeast Asia, right? It's in Cambodia. You can see it here in Thailand. You can see it in Indonesia from the 13th century on. Why is this important? It's important because we think about what unites Southeast Asia. And if you were trying to communicate within a setting in ASEAN, you think about what do many countries share in common? If I make an allusion to Rama or I talk about the Ramayana, will people understand what I'm referring to? And that is one text that we might say that's interwoven throughout many Southeast Asian countries. Educational texts are another way in which we see different ideas circulating throughout Southeast Asia. This is a Buddhist educational text, and that's something else that is circulated throughout Southeast Asia. So I'm thinking of the points of commonality, because ultimately communication is about a point of communicality between different countries, individuals, target audiences. And so people have to think about what do people share and what do people have in common. So before I turn to Vietnam, I want to mention something that is problematic to some extent about how this idea of Asian values has come into communication studies, because Asian values really comes from one place, and that's Singapore. This is where the concept of Asian values began. And a lot of communication strategists have thought about how Singapore, they've kind of taken Singapore and they've used it to think about the whole of Southeast Asia. And I think this is very problematic because Singapore is a very particular kind of place, and its so-called values are very particular as well. If we think about Singapore and we think about Asian values, we have to think about whose Asian values we're talking about. And at the core of Singapore's, many of the ways in which Singapore society is constructed lies this man, Lee Kuan Yew. who you can see in his memoir here, The Singapore Story. It's important to talk about Singapore because Singapore is also what many communication theorists and writers focus on when they look at Southeast Asia, because Singapore is such an important, it's a center of finance, it's a center of banking, it's one of the top countries in the world in which to do business. So it's very important for many communication strategists to look at Singapore. But if we think about the Asian values of Singapore, right, then we also have to think, okay, we give Singapore we give it some kind of kudos for how it has developed, and I do, from its, it being thought of as a colonial backwater in the 1960s up to the present, the kind of success that we now see in Singapore. But if we look at the ethnic composition of it, right, we also have to say, okay, if we're talking about communication strategies in Singapore or Asian values of Singapore, what Singapore are we talking about? The dominant Chinese, 75%? Are we talking about the Malays? Are we talking about the Indians? Are we talking about people who are citizens or permanent residents? So in any given context, thinking about the ethnic composition, thinking about how people, what kind of audience you're looking at, but also how you're summing up the kind of values of a society as you think about how to communicate in different contexts. It's so important to understand the difference of how societies are ethnically composed. And for Singapore, I think this is, for many theorists who look at Singapore, they're really just talking about Chinese Singapore. They're not thinking about the rest of Singapore, which is very important to consider. We won't go into lessons. Let's talk about language just for 1 minute. So in Singapore, if communication strategists are talking about Singapore as a case study, they're often looking at 2 of those languages. They're only really looking at English and Chinese because they think of them as the fundamental languages of Singapore, and Malay and Tamil, which are other recognized languages of Singapore, are not given the same kind of treatment or the same kind of theoretical or academic consideration. And I think that that's very problematic. So one thing that we have to also think about is how communication strategies and race interact with one another, right? And here, if we look at Singapore, we can see that race and Singapore are very sensitive issues as they interact with each other, right? And we have many documents about how Lee Kuan Yew believed that Malays were underachieving compared to Chinese. What did this mean? It meant when they did the textbooks in the 1980s, they gave them a racial slant. This led to growing racial identification amongst children. So this is how, within looking at textbooks, how textbooks communicated jobs, employment, education, how they formed a concept of race. And this is very problematic. So we see in the mid-1990s a shift away from these kinds of racial stereotypes. I want to show you one example of this, and I'm sorry that this is a little blurred. It's taken from an academic paper, so the text is a little difficult to read, but you can see that this is from a child's textbook, and 2 children are saying to each other, "Who is he?" And one says to the other, "Who is he?" And the response is, "He's Mr. Ahmed." And the other child says, "Is he a teacher?" And the other child says, "No, he's not. He's a bus driver." And this is the kind of textbook that we see in Singapore in the 1980s. So people who built advertising campaigns, who built communication strategies in Singapore, this is also the kinds of things they were building off, these racial stereotypes, right? So we're looking at an audience. The Chinese are achieving, and they are indeed the teachers. Good afternoon, children, says Miss Chen in the next slide. So we also see how this is not just children's textbooks, this is how a society is reflecting itself. And that is also how people are going in to make strategies, communication strategies in Singapore, how they are going to devise them, because this is the society that they are reading into, right? And these things are very important, how race is constructed. As I mentioned, we see shifts away from this kind of racial stereotyping, but I think that to understand how Singapore has been used as a model is you have to look at some of these problems, which I think have really come out. So let's look at what Asian values, people talk a lot about Asian values. What are we talking about if we look at Singapore as an example? Sorry, I went one slide too far there. I don't know if you can go back. Thank you. Okay, so for many people say, okay, we look at Singapore's Asian values, but what are they? Are they Confucian? Are they just part of Confucianism, which is very influential in Singapore? Are they Southeast Asian? What are Southeast Asian values? Is this true? The second point, Asians value education. They save more money. Is that Asian values? Are they more likely to sacrifice personal interests for the collective good? In some cases, maybe that's true, in others not. This is also an argument of Asian values. Opposition and too much free speech are unsuitable and potentially damaging to Asian societies. That is what Singapore said about the Philippines, right? Like they have too much free speech. But is that just Singapore's value, or is that an Asian value? And security and stability over human rights, which is a lesson that China's taken from Singapore. The last point, individualism versus collectivism. Is Asian values always the collective over the individual? Is that true for every single context in Southeast Asia, in every different country? These are things that people think about, because to sum up Asian values for a whole region, I think is very difficult to do, given all the diversity of the societies and the geographies that I've talked to you about. So I'm always very skeptical when people talk to me about Asian values, because I say, who's Asia? What Asia are you talking about? Asia is a vast region. Southeast Asia is a vast region. You're talking about East Asia, South Asia. Southeast Asia itself is huge and vast. So it's so I think it's important to also be thinking about these things as well. Let me talk about Vietnam for a minute, because this is let's move away from Singapore and the idea of Asian values, and let's talk about Vietnam for a minute, where I have done a lot of research. Singapore I've studied and talked about and taught for decades, but Vietnam is my main site of research. So along with Cambodia, which I lived in and loved. So Vietnam, to understand Vietnam and to understand how you would devise a communication strategy for Vietnam, or understand the Vietnamese identity, is to understand the role of literature and poetry in Vietnamese society, which is extremely important. And I'm going to give you one recent example of the importance of it. But first, if we look at the Temple of Literature in Hanoi in 1070, you can see that the role of poetry and literature is fundamental to the Vietnamese psyche, to the Vietnamese mentality, because learning poetry and being part of what was a Vietnamese system of education that put a great emphasis on memorizing and understanding poetry and ability with language is what is interwoven into the idea of Vietnamese culture today. One thing I wanted to mention was that, let me actually go a little bit forward here. There's some poetry I would like to tell you, because I love poetry, but this book is the most important book of poetry in Vietnamese, in the history of Vietnam, The Tale of Q, 1817. How important is this? This is so important that if I stand up in a class in the United States with Vietnamese Americans in my audience and I say, recite the beginning of the Tale of Q, they can almost certainly do it. Everyone memorizes sections of it. It's the most important book in Vietnamese culture. So it's used for fortune telling. It's used for everything that you can imagine. People memorize it. They do it at New Year. They show it in dramas and plays and operas. To be able to quote from it, to understand it, means that you understand Vietnamese culture. If you went there as an Indonesian and you were thinking about how you wanted to work for a media company or communications company, and you wanted to draw on the culture and literature of the country, this is your first place to start, right? But to understand a culture is also to understand how important books like this are. And it comes in huge texts. It comes in teeny little texts you can carry in your pocket everywhere, so you can have it with you at all times. And as I mentioned, at Vietnamese New Year, people often use it as a means to tell fortunes by looking through it and checking the page numbers. I've never done that myself, but I know that people do that. So it's extremely important. There's another little version of it. As I said, it comes in many versions. So now we come to 1994. 1994 is a key year in Vietnamese history because it is the year in which Bill Clinton raised the embargo against Vietnam. And at the time, he is looking for the best way to do this. He is looking for the best possible speech to communicate to the Vietnamese people that this is a new era, this is a new time, this is a new moment in history for Vietnam and for the United States. If you don't know this history, then you probably know of the Vietnam War, but you will not understand that by 1994, sanctions against Vietnam by the United States had meant the Vietnamese economy had greatly suffered. I first went to Vietnam in 1991, and the poverty I saw in Vietnam at that time was truly shocking. Today, I can go to Ho Chi Minh City, and it is unrecognizable from how it was then. The changes that have taken place over the years are absolutely amazing. So Vietnam was suffering a great deal under the embargo by the United States, which meant no business could take place with Vietnam. This was over the issue of the return of the remains of American soldiers from Vietnam, their bodies from Vietnam, which had actually all taken place by this point. So Bill Clinton thinks, okay, I've got to give a speech. I've got to do a really good speech. What do I do? So what does he do? He thinks about how he can interweave Vietnamese literature into his talk. And he comes to Yale, which at that time, Yale University, where I was doing my PhD, and he asks us to write his speech. Well, actually, his wife came, but we'll say it was him for the sake of the story. Hillary Clinton did it. So she came and said, we need the best possible speech. What do we say? What allusions do we use? What metaphors do we use? How do we communicate to the Vietnamese population that we're serious about this? And we said, there's only one poem to use. There's only one thing you can use, and that's the Tale of Q. So we looked for the best passage from that poem for him, and this is how it reads. That's actually, I wanted to, it reads like this. This is what his speech said, this is one of the passages he used from the Tale of Q. He used several passages, but this is one of the passages he used from that epic poem of 1817. As the Tale of Q foretold, just as the lotus wilts, The mums bloom forth, time softens grief, and the winter turns to spring. Now the frozen images of the past have begun to thaw. The outlines of a warmer, shared future have begun to take place. Let us make the most of this new spring together. Okay, so that's only one passage he used from the Tale of Q in his speech. That's part of the opening of it. It is so important that he used the Tale of Q, because for the Vietnamese population, they said, this is someone who understands us. This is someone who understands us. And look how it begins, as the Tale of Q foretold, as if the Tale of Q knew everything, right? People use it to fortune tell. And now Bill Clinton's drawing on that illusion to say, as the Tale of Q foretold, just as the lotus wilts, the mums bloom forth, time softens grief, and the winter turns to spring. So you can see that he's using the most important poem to communicate a very important message. And this is one of the reasons, this use of Vietnamese poetry, allusion, metaphor in his speech, and many other factors leads to the fact that today, if we could go to the previous slide, please. Thank you. The one up before, is that nowadays we have this US-Vietnam naval exercises. Vietnam and the US have never had a closer relationship than they do today. And one of the reasons for that is the US thinking carefully. There are many factors, but one of the reasons is thinking about Vietnam very culturally, strategically. And I showed you one example from the beginning of the relationship after the war, Vietnam War in 1994 until today. Of course, there are many other geopolitical reasons, but it's very, very important if you're dealing within cultures and countries to understand how you are going to talk to them. And so his use of that poem, I think, was very, very strategic. And it was not just me, but other people within the Southeast Asia program at Yale who suggested to him that this is how you really reach people, is to use the Tale of Q. And the Vietnamese newspapers after his talk were full of, he knows the Tale of Q, he read the Tale of Q, you know. Now, truthfully, did he read the whole of the Tale of Q? No. Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Mention about bakso.
Oh.
Suddenly all Indonesian people feel that Indonesian people.
Exactly. Obama's very good at that stuff too. Both Clinton and Obama are very good at these communication strategies. So yes, that's a very good point. So not just, so this, I'm telling you about one of the most important poems within Vietnamese culture, but it's also important to understand that, and I'm just going to go ahead to this slide, that it's not just the Tale of Q that's important. Poetry for leadership is important in Vietnam too. Here we have Ho Chi Minh. On the right side, we have General Giap, who is the military mastermind of the Vietnam War. Both these men wrote poetry. So poetry and politics and culture are absolutely interwoven in Vietnam. So if you want to understand Vietnamese mentality and thinking and psyche, and you want respect in that context, you have to understand how poetry operates. I don't know so much about Indonesian poetry. I don't know how that works and if it's something that matters, but many other things will matter that are different than that, right? So it's to understand what is so important within a culture. And in this case, it is poetry that's very important. So before we leave looking at the ASEAN countries here, let's just talk about the fact that 2 of the countries in Southeast Asia are still socialist. This is from Laos. It's also important as you think about, I know I'm talking about the incredible development of Vietnam today. Let's not forget that 2 of the last communist countries in the world are in Southeast Asia. If you're working in those countries, you've got to understand how socialism operates and how communism operates, right? Very basic point, but sometimes I forget Vietnam's communist, to be quite honest. When I'm there, I forget it's communist, but it is communist. So that's also something else that we have to think about. in that context. So started this talk by talking about ASEAN. Here's our ASEAN flag. Here's the summit last year, the US ASEAN Special Summit. This is the lawn of the White House in Washington, D.C., a very important summit that Joe Biden called the ASEAN leaders together to talk together in Washington, D.C. How ASEAN countries are able to communicate with each other, understand each other, the language that they can use with each other is going to really affect Indonesia's future. And figuring out good communication strategies, good ways to reach other Southeast Asian countries is very important. And this photograph really sums that up, that these people that being together at a special summit like this and being able to truly communicate and interact with each other in a productive way is going to really affect the future of Indonesia. So, and the as Southeast Asia and ASEAN faces the future, remember that that Southeast Asia still contains a huge diversity of places. That's Singapore at the top, that's Ratnakiri, Northeast Cambodia on the bottom. We're talking about a region of such diversity, such differences in rural urban divides in terms of wealth, and to think about this as a region in which communication strategies can be applicable, it's very important to truly think about the kind of audience that you are wanting to address. So let me just say some concluding remarks, and then I'm very interested to let me say one thing actually before on technology, okay? Because I think this is also, let me make one point about the new kinds of technologies that are coming up that I think are going to affect the way that people think communication studies can work. So I think it's also very important to think about how new technologies fit into communication studies. And I want to highlight the kinds of online translation programs like Google Translate and Chat GPT, because I have students who say to me, why should we really understand these other countries or learn their languages? Because now with Google Translate, AI, we just kind of say like, write a culturally appropriate poem for me for Vietnamese people, right? That's what you might think. Like, why do we have to learn all this stuff? We can ask AI. I need to talk to Vietnamese people. What's important to them? You know, and it's going to tell me. But I think this is a really big mistake because, and I'm going to tell you why. Some people say to me, with such new tools, why would old ways in which language is needed really be appropriate? And if language lies at the heart of inter-Asian communication, doesn't AI provide the means by which we can really communicate? And I think this is a good question to raise. And I need French for my research because Vietnam and Cambodia were French colonies. I read French. Do I love Google Translate French? Don't tell anyone, but yes, I love it. It's really good. It's actually very good. Is Google Translate good for Vietnamese? Absolutely not. It's nonsensical. You can put in a Vietnamese passage and it will be rubbish. Absolutely nonsensical. Why is that? Well, I'm not going to go into the complexities of Vietnamese linguistics for you, but because Vietnamese is not, it's very difficult to know where a word begins and a word ends. AI can't figure that out. So you're going to end up, if any of you study Chinese, you'll have the same, you'll have the same idea that it also at this point can't do Chinese either for some of the same reasons. Are you talking about Thai there or? Yeah, I don't know how it is for Thai. Yeah, I don't know if it works for Thai, but I know for Vietnamese. Yeah, and I think it's very difficult for a program, an AI program. I can guarantee you if you sat down and type a Vietnamese passage into AI, into Google Translate, you are going to be like, what? Like, that doesn't make, it's complete gibberish, to use a good English word. So it's not true for French. It's good for French. So I'm not like some old fogey about, you know, new technologies. It's good for French. But one thing I did want to mention also is that a program like ChatGPT is only as good as the information that it has. And within the Vietnamese academic community, people talked about how ChatGPT produced folk tales on Vietnam that they'd never heard of. So one of my colleagues asked ChatGPT to identify the 8 most important Vietnamese folk tales. Think how important that would be for a communication strategy if you want to draw on cultural illusion. So ChatGPT produced 8 different folk tales, 2 of which it made up. Because my colleague said to the group, large group, I've never heard of this folk tale. Does anyone know it? And it was about a fisherman who, I won't go into the details of the folk tale, but it was to do with a fisherman and what he found in the sea and to do with some gold. So everyone wrote to the colleague and said, no, this is made up. ChatGPT made it up. ChatGPT is an algorithm, right? All it does is create what it thinks is the most plausible answer. And if you ask it about folk tales, it will draw from the world's folk tales. And it will think, Vietnam, it's got a long coast, it's got fishermen, it's probably got a folk tale about fishermen. Now, ChatGPT doesn't think, it's just an algorithm. So 2 out of those 8 stories were completely made up. And that is a problem with AI because it only draws from the information that it has. It actually doesn't know if something is true or not. So you could have gone and thought, wow, I've got this great folk tale that I'm going to build a media strategy about in Vietnam. And guess what? It's made up. So you've got to be very careful in your use of AI. It's a wonderful resource, and ChatGPT is a wonderful resource, but it's only as good as the information that it has. And on subjects it does not have much information on, it will make up what it doesn't know. And you've got to remember that. It's not, what it says is not necessarily true. So I've seen within literary studies, ChatGPT is not capable of creating nuanced or indeed even accurate depictions and descriptions of Southeast Asian cultural contexts. So to conclude, considering Southeast Asian communication studies, I think that one way to increase a kind of focus on this is for different universities to be able to think about inter-Asian communication, not just West Asia communication, but inter-Asian communication, meaning throughout the countries of Southeast Asia themselves. And if within the humanities, including communication studies, we mirror some of the ways that innovation is taking place within the region of Southeast Asia, then the trend would be towards not just thinking of Southeast Asia as this collection of bordered nation states, but rather as a series of global transformations, influences, migrations, trade, and political, literary, cultural formations. And at the heart of that will lie better ways for the countries of Southeast Asia to communicate with each other and for better communication strategies that will lead to better interregional trends and increased revitalization. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation and for listening to me today. So thank you.
Okay. I would like to say thank you to Professor Lorraine Peterson for your very insightful lecture. Before we are going to question and answer session, I would like to ask Professor Ruiki III Abalena at West Visayas State University in Philippines to give your insight or maybe your perspective or maybe all about Asian perspective. To Professor Ricky III Abalena, time and screen is yours.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to contribute to this very valuable engagements today. And before I proceed, I would like to congratulate, of course, UB for organizing such endeavor for us to share. In fact, this is very consistent with what Lorraine was saying about trying to improve our engagements here in the ASEAN region. And also, hi to Lorraine, first and foremost. Also, thank you for this very enriching lecture today. As a professor of communication, particularly one teaching communication in the ASEAN setting last semester, I find this encounter with you today very enriching, because in fact I would like also to reiterate what you were saying about the ideas that there's so much diversity in the ASEAN region alone, and it's so difficult to really confine or can us into just one. But the other thing that I have noticed is because of the strengthening of the ASEAN as an organization today, we are also becoming very close with each other. In fact, my engagements with UB has something to do with that, because we wanted to expand our cooperation among the different countries. And in fact, as academics, of course, we are expected to be sharing with each other from time to time the knowledge and expertise that we have. And while I also agree that it's difficult for us now to get away or get rid totally of the colonial constructs among us, little by little, we are trying to address that in such a way that's such a theme for now, emphasizing multiculturalism in using the Asian or even ASEAN perspective, for that matter, is one step towards that. And from the Philippine perspective, for instance, and as I have already shared this also with my previous engagements with UB before, one thing that we are trying to use now is really to go into the grassroots, the ground, and really communicate with real people, as opposed to the AI that have been discussed earlier as well. So because these are the real people who will tell you the real things, and these are the real things that will strengthen your stance, or even your actions about many things in the region. And because you see, more and more, because the strength of the ASEAN integration is well felt now, more and more there are Filipinos teaching English in Indonesia, in Thailand, in Vietnam, Cambodia, and even Singapore for a while. Although Singapore has been benefiting a lot of our nurses and engineers and our domestic helpers from time to time. We are also acknowledging the idea that Indonesians are coming to, especially the southern region of the Philippines, because of the commonality in terms of religion, that is Islam. So more and more, the ASEAN integration is doing good for us, and it is this idea of trying to be with the real people and trying to strengthen our stance in whatever things that we wanted to proceed, including communication for that matter. And basically, history would tell us, or even cultures would tell us, that commonalities have been very strong, especially between Indonesia and the Philippines in language, for instance, like the words jalan, for instance, which can be road or street, can be, sometimes we say, in my native language, it's dalan. In the Filipino language, it's daan, and this jalan is very similar. And a lot of other languages, just like our history would tell us, that we have all commonalities, of course, with Spanish, because of the our colonial history with Spain. And of course, we are benefiting a lot from America. Our strength as an English-speaking nation today is because of our engagements with America for a very, very long time, and so on and so forth. So yes, and I look forward to more engagements like this, and very happy that last minute I was invited here because Doc Pia, for instance, was thinking I was already traveling, but I have not left here because of still waiting for the visa, and I'm very happy to engage with you this morning. And again, I would like to thank Lauren for spending time with her Southeast Asian counterparts, and I hope that in the future we can see each other and maybe we can invite each other as well. Thank you very much for this time.
Thank you very much, Prof. Ricky, for your comment and insight to us. Before we are going to question and answer session, I will give a briefly summarize in Indonesia to the attendance here, because I think not of the attendance cannot speak English in a good way. So, oke, jadi ada beberapa insight begitu ya dari Profesor Lorraine. Ini yang saya catat itu ada sekitar 35, tapi hanya akan ada beberapa saja yang akan saya berikan kepada teman-teman di sini. Yang pertama itu adalah kita itu untuk mempelajari Southeast Asia, itu kita harus belajar ke Amerika, kita harus belajar ke Eropa, kita harus belajar ke Australia. Tapi amat sangat jarang ditemukan ada orang yang belajar tentang Southeast Asia di negara yang Southeast Asia juga seperti itu. Dan menurut Profesor Lorraine, ini kok bisa jadi problem seperti itu. Nah, kenapa bagi Profesor Lorraine ini sedikit masalah begitu ya? Profesor Lorraine di sini tuh memperkenalkan satu istilah yang sangat menarik, collective linkage. Jadi bagaimana antara negara-negara di Southeast Asia itu sebenarnya saling terkoneksi satu sama lain. Kayak misalkan tadi contoh yang diberikan oleh Prof. Lorraine itu adalah Ramayana. Jadi ternyata Ramayana ini itu tidak hanya dikenal di India begitu, tidak hanya dikenal di Indonesia, tapi juga dikenal dengan sangat baik di Kamboja dan juga di Thailand seperti itu. Dan kemudian ada banyak hal lagi yang itu sebenarnya kita memiliki kepiripan selain selain mitos-mitos ataupun cerita tentang Ramayana tadi. Nah, tapi anehnya begitu ya, kita punya banyak collective linkage begitu ya, oral tradition, folk tales, origin myth, inscription, religious text, kemudian kita pernah dijajah oleh Eropa begitu, tapi pemahaman kita terhadap satu sama lain itu masih sangat kurang seperti itu. Dan menurut Profesor Lorraine itu salah satu pintu masuk paling mudah itu dengan mempelajari bahasanya. Karena bahasa itulah yang embedded ke culture, ke politik, dan ke segala aspek kehidupan kita seperti itu. Dan menurut Prof. Lorraine juga, ini kalau kita ngomongin tentang Asia, itu Asia yang kita obrolin itu problematik. Asia yang kita obrolkan itu problematik karena konstruksi tentang Asian values itu datang dari Singapura begitu. Yang mana sebenarnya itu tidak mencerminkan Asia secara keseluruhan. Prof. Lorraine mengatakan bahwa Singapura itu hanya satu wilayah dengan konteks budaya yang spesifik, dan apa yang mereka katakan tentang Asia itu sebenarnya tidak merepresentasikan Asia secara keseluruhan begitu. Makanya tadi di awal-awal itu Prof. Lorraine itu mengatakan bahwa kita itu harus memahami Asia secara plural, bukan secara singular. Karena Asia itu punya beragam konteks budaya yang itu antara negara yang satu sama negara yang lain itu berbeda-beda. Nah, saya tidak akan membicarakan lebih lanjut tentang masalah di Asian Values of Singapore begitu ya, karena kalau tadi kita berikan contoh Asian Values-nya Singapura itu sangat rasis begitu. Jadi apa yang disebut sebagai Asia itu sebenarnya ya nilai-nilai Chinese Singaporean aja begitu, tapi tidak mencerminkan nilai-nilai dari Malay ataupun Indian seperti itu. Dan bahkan konstruksi tentang Asia ini itu juga sampai diajarkan di buku-buku teks sekolah untuk anak SD begitu. Jadi kayak tadi tuh Prof. Lorraine dengan sangat-sangat bagus, ini sangat insightful bagi saya begitu ya, diberikan contoh bagaimana buku anak SD itu memperlihatkan percakapan antara anak kecil dengan orang Malay, dengan anak kecil dengan seorang Chinese Singaporean gitu. Nah, dengan orang Malay, anak kecil itu bertanya, apakah Anda adalah seorang teacher? No, saya adalah sopir bus begitu Bu ya. Kemudian ketika diperkenalkan itu orang Chinese Singapura, itu kemudian dikatakan bahwa disebutkan nama Singapurnya begitu, nama Chinese-nya, kemudian diperkenalkan bahwa beliau adalah teacher di situ. Jadi bisa dilihat bahwa konstruksi ini sebenarnya sudah embedded sampai ke sampai ke buku-buku pelajarannya seperti itu. Dan karena tadi Prof. Loren itu sangat fasih dengan Vietnam. Dan jujur saja sebagai orang di Asia Tenggara, kita pasti baru tahu kan tentang the tale of Q, right? Oke, the tale of Q, bahwa ini adalah pintu masuk untuk mempelajari kebudayaan Vietnam secara lebih baik. Bahkan ketika Amerika Serikat melakukan embargo terhadap Vietnam setelah perang Vietnam gitu ya, Vietnam War begitu, kemudian Vietnam economic is decline, sangat parah, sangat rusak begitu. Kemudian Amerika itu ingin masuk kembali. Nah, bertanyalah Clinton ini itu ke tempatnya Prof. Loren itu ngambil S3 di Yale University, nanya di Southeast Asian Department, itu nanya kira-kira pintu masuk untuk ke ke orang Vietnam itu apa. Kemudian orang-orang dari departemen itu, ya saya menduga mungkin Prof. Loren sendiri begitu, itu mengatakan lewat the tale of Q seperti itu. Jadi ini adalah pintu masuk untuk mempelajari bagaimana kebudayaan Vietnam itu. Dan ternyata setelah Amerika, Bill Clinton itu memasukkan pidatonya dengan mengutip the tale of Q yang dikatakan bahwa winter sebentar lagi, winter itu apa ya? Musim dingin ya, musim dingin sebentar lagi akan hilang dan berganti dengan spring begitu ya, musim semi seperti itu menandakan bahwa oke, ekonomi Vietnam sekarang lagi turun, tapi entar lagi nih itu bakal naik nih ekonomi Vietnam seperti itu. Dan tadi Prof. Loren itu memberikan ilustrasi bagaimana sebelumnya tidak pernah terjadi hubungan yang sangat erat antara tentaranya Amerika dengan tentaranya Vietnam begitu. Ini tidak pernah terjadi sebelumnya, baru sedemikian eratnya itu ketika Bill Clinton itu kemudian pidato dengan mengutip the tale of Q tadi itu tersebut begitu. Nah, kemudian yang terakhir itu Prof. Loren itu menyatakan bahwa teknologi ini penting untuk memahami satu sama lain karena ada Google Translate, ChatGPT, AI segala macam, dan kita bisa bertanya kita bisa mentranslate bahasa kita ke Google Translate ataupun menggunakan ChatGPT untuk mempelajari kebudayaan yang ada di Southeast Asia. Tapi ternyata yang menarik adalah ternyata Google Translate itu tidak terlalu bagus untuk digunakan dalam bahasa Vietnam. Kalau yang saya pelajari di bahasa Indonesia udah lumayan oke lah ya. Kita Indonesian to English itu kan is quite good. It's not perfect but it's good begitu. Nah, tapi ternyata kalau katanya Prof. Loren nggak bagus, jelek. Hasilnya pakai Google Translate itu amburadul begitu. Dan kemudian itu juga ada orang koleganya Prof. Loren yang itu kemudian bertanya kepada ChatGPT itu apa dongeng-dongeng folk tales, fairy tale begitu from Vietnam yang itu agar kita untuk mengenal Vietnam itu apa sih dongengnya. Nah, ChatGPT kemudian memberikan 8 rekomendasi, 8 list tentang dongeng-dongeng yang ada di Vietnam, dan surprisingly 2 dari 8 dongeng tersebut itu palsu, tidak pernah ada di Vietnam seperti itu. Jadi mungkin sama kayak kita yang menanyakan tentang literatur di di Google di ChatGPT, tapi ternyata literaturnya itu palsu semua begitu ya. Mungkin teman-teman pernah ini. Oke. Itu tadi kesimpulan. Jadi kesimpulannya itu adalah harus ada inter-Asian communication in Southeast Asian, especially in Southeast Asian universities. Jadi biar kita ini bisa lebih mengenal satu sama lain seperti itu. Jadi kita ini untuk mempelajari Southeast Asia tidak perlu lagi ke Amerika, in Cornell University, or in Australian National University, or some universities in European. Tapi kita bisa mempelajari Southeast Asia itu di negara-negara Asia Tenggara itu sendiri. Oke, if you have a question, please directly ask to Prof. Loren. Oke, Prof. Loren, Do you prefer to answer the question directly, or maybe you will answer after several audiences ask to you? Okay, 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 oke, 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 oke. Oke, silakan. Ada yang ingin bertanya? Bisa dalam bahasa Inggris atau bahasa Indonesia. Kalau bahasa Indonesia akan saya coba untuk terjemahkan begitu. Silakan. Oke, Bu Pia.
Yes, I can give some comments regarding this lecture today. It's really interesting. It's opened up my eyes that how important is Asian perspective for example, in my area of expertise is in public relations. Sometimes we always think that public relations strategies has to follow the Western theory, but by understanding the Asian culture, well, actually will give some benefits to public relation practitioners to understand more about the stakeholders. For example, well, this is very popular ones. If we remember the Crazy Rich Asia, this is how the Singaporean portray the culture. So the Chinese is the richest ones, okay, and then the Indians is the security guards ones, okay. So we might think that okay, for Singapore, if you are rich, you must be Chinese. Okay, and then you poor one, and then you the labor one, you must be Indians, right? So this is important how to understand the Singaporean culture. So that's why Indonesian also have to understand how the people, thinking about themselves. Like for some people, maybe we don't realize because I think this is not a big issue for us. Like, or Japanese people are more smarter than Papua's people. Or sometimes people think that Batak's people or from the north of Sumatra, they are very rough and nasty compared to Japanese people that are more soft and polite and sophisticated. So sometimes there is a misunderstanding about that. And sometimes that misunderstanding can impact to how public relation practitioners develop the communication strategies. This is a very good example. I still remember Professor Loren, how American company, may I say in ExxonMobil Cepu Limited, this is an American company running in the middle of Java in the residence of Bojonegoro. The first time they run their community, the corporate social responsibility of CSR, they failed because they don't understand the culture and how the people in Bojonegoro live. And after I become their consultant, and then I suggest them to change the direction. Like for example, hiring the local staff in their community relations department. Why? Because they know how to talk to the elders. They know how to talk to the Pak Lurah, the chief of the village. And they know the custom. So that's why every kind of Exxon Mobil to give them back to the community have to suitable with the people life. It's not as like, well, they try hard to modernize Bojonegoro. But again, people in Bojonegoro not ready yet to become more Western or more modern. So that's why this is very interesting topic for us. It's not only in some of global communication, but also in the particular study in communication. Like for example, in popular communication or what is that, Mas Hair? Culture, popular culture, pop culture. Also, it's very important in public relation as well. So thank you so much for your what is that, your time, for sharing your knowledge for us, especially how we can understand the people through the literature, the poems, something that's nowadays the young generation will be missed this one, or they think that our poem is not important. But again, I still remember how Indonesian people love pantun. You know, pantun. Pantun is like what is that? Is this traditional portray? Yes. So they have rhymes in the end of the words. So that's make us Indonesian people can communicate each other once you deliver a pantun. So I think in now in even in very important events or national events, sometimes the master of ceremony deliver a pantun, and then all the audience say "cakep." Okay, that's make us understand each other. So thank you again, Professor Lauren. It's great insight. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bu Pia. You will comment or
Just to say thank you for those wonderful comments. And I couldn't agree more about the need for thinking. I'm not surprised at all Exxon's communication strategy failed because they didn't understand the cultural context in which they were dealing. And I think that that's one of the most important points that I hope you take from my talk is that not only is there an incredible diversity of Asian contexts, but even within a country itself, of course, there are many layers to it and often great cultural diversity between different regions of a country. Even countries not as big as Indonesia, which has so many languages and islands and cultures, a country like Vietnam, the culture in Hanoi versus Ho Chi Minh City is often quite different too. And so it's important to know countries regionally as well as the country sort of overall too. So thank you for this comment.
okay, thank you, Prof. Lorraine. Anyone? Maybe in online participant or offline participant? Ada pertanyaan, teman-teman? Silakan. In Indonesia, it's okay. I will try to translate to English.
Wonderful translator here. We're going to do many languages. We've got Indonesian, anyone in Khmer, Vietnamese. We've got Dutch over there, French. We take. Oh, wonderful. We've got Filipino, we've got Thai, so ask your languages and we're like ASEAN. We're like ASEAN right here.
Oke, tadi Prof. Loren mengatakan ya karena kita sih ya udah, ayo bertanya dengan bahasa kita gitu. Nanti karena sini banyak yang jago-jago bahasa Inggris nanti bisa dibantu untuk diterjemahkan begitu. Oke, silakan ada mungkin teman-teman silakan. Oke. Siapa namanya? Pakai mikrofon biar yang online bisa mendengar di. Oke.
Good afternoon, Prof. Lorraine. My name is Tika. I have a question. Like, despite those differences that you've been talking about, and I want to know, is there actually a common thread between, between those differences that makes communication from Asian perspective different from Western perspective, or maybe African perspective, or maybe a European perspective? That's all my question.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Oke, silakan Mbak. Siapa namanya? Tania. Oke, silakan Mbak Tania.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity, Prof. Lauren. And today we're talking about Asian perspective in multicultural communication, which specifically you talk about Singaporean, you talk about Vietnam. My question is, we as an Asian is such a Asian is when we talk about Asian, we're referring to the continent of Asian, but we do have East Asian, which is Japan, Korean, and China. They have their own culture. We also have West Asian when we talk about India, and here we are Southeast Asian. How should we approach this? Should we divide ourselves as a different side of Asia in which we are Southeast Asia with our probably relatively similar culture within Southeast Asia, or how should we propose ourselves in this Asian perspective? When I say we, I mean in Southeast Asian side. Thank you.
Oke, thank you Mbak Tania ya. Oke, thank you. Oke.
Thank you.
Okay, please.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Let me answer Tika's question first about Southeast Asia, what unites? What are the common threads? And that's a really good question. I think that there are people who are Southeast Asia itself is an artificial construct, and it comes from the Second World War. The idea of Southeast Asia, the term comes from the Second World War, and it was part of the Southeast Asia Command under Lord Mountbatten. It also included Sri Lanka at that time. Actually, the concept of Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka is quite far away, as you know. So Sri Lanka is no longer part of Southeast Asia, obviously. But so some scholars originally said, look, this is just put together, right? It's an artificial construction of these countries. But then we come to the foundation of ASEAN in 1967, and it's what ASEAN has done as a body is change and adapt in a way that's unusual for an international forum like ASEAN, because it was established as an anti-communist organization, and the founder members of ASEAN, of which Indonesia was one, founded it against communism. Then over the years, of course, Vietnam joined, Cambodia joined, Laos joined. Every country in Southeast Asia, with the exception of Timor-Leste, is part of it today. That's quite an achievement in terms of rethinking what a community is, right? So you have ASEAN integrating itself more regionally with all of the kinds of exchange programs that operate, the Writers' Prize for Southeast Asian Culture. You have all the ways in which the cultures and societies of the countries are trying to integrate, and economically, they're going to become even more integrated because they're hoping for a one Asian economic community, which will integrate easily the countries of Southeast Asia. Timor-Leste, former East Timor, as you know, will join ASEAN, I'm almost sure, which means they'll be all 11 countries of Southeast Asia will be in ASEAN. This is unusual. There's this much integration in terms of a vision for a kind of one economic bloc. Even in the European Union, you don't have quite the same vision. So I would say looking to the future, we're going to see more integration. You know, looking to the past, I think some of the ways an experience of colonialism is also, we also have a lot of connections with religion between obviously Malaysia and Indonesia, but we also have the Cham Muslims of Vietnam and Cambodia. And so we have a Muslim community throughout Southeast Asia, as well as a Chinese diaspora as well. And religion, you know, we have Buddhism, we have the Hindu links. Yesterday, some of the temples of East Java, you know, I sent a photograph of myself at one to my sister, and she said, "Are you Angkor Wat? Where are you?" You know, it's like, no, I'm in East Java. I'm in East Java. So she knew I was here. She was teasing me because she knows I love Angkor Wat. But so, you know, there are all of these. So there are historic linkages, but there are also linkages really for the future, you know. Scholars sometimes divide island from mainland. So they might think of the island places of Southeast Asia and the mainland places as having different histories because of Theravada Buddhism on the mainland and because the islands have a different history. But I wouldn't divide it that way. I would just see the future as more integration and more cooperation and more knowledge. You know, you may ask, well, isn't China more important than the other countries in Southeast Asia? Isn't Korea more important? Isn't Japan? Those are valid questions to ask. But for Indonesia's future, being part of Southeast Asia and being at the center of Southeast Asia, you're putting yourself into a very powerful block of countries, which can only help Indonesia in the future, you know? So, and also a country like Vietnam, its economy is growing. It's 100 million people. It's not a small country. It's actually becoming economically powerful in the region and will only become more so because it's got one of the fastest growing economies in the world. It also is not badly affected by COVID because of its policies there. So that's looking to the future. Yeah. And for the other question about Southeast Asia and South Asia and East Asia, that's a great question because I think that some of the ways that Asian values have been encapsulated, they come from Singapore, but those values are what we might think of as Confucian and East Asian to some extent, actually more than Southeast Asian. So I think what we've seen generally is that the way in which Asia has been conceived has been much more Sino-centric, with China at the center of that. And the values we see in Singapore, a lot of that has been taken from Chinese ideas. So I think that there are differences between the way that Southeast Asia, there are definitely there's a great deal of variation and difference in the countries of Southeast Asia itself. But I think also in terms of the ways in which it interacts with East Asia and South Asia, it's also quite different. ASEAN's relationship to India is something which India is trying to promote more interaction within to South Asia to kind of counterbalance China's presence in the region. So it'll be interesting to see how much of that develops in the future. But it's a really good question to think about. So thank you for it.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Lorraine. But unfortunately, we have reached our time limit for this lecture. So, terima kasih banyak. Thank you so much to Professor Lorraine for your insightful lecture. Terima kasih banyak juga untuk teman-teman semua yang hadir di sini. Kemudian kepada teman-teman yang hadir juga secara online. Juga especially for Professor Ricky III Abalena from Philippines. Thank you so much. Saya akhiri, terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih. Thank you very much for coming.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Lorraine, as well as Mr. Abdul Khair, for the very insightful session. We have learned a lot of things that we might learn, understand as an Asian ourselves. But thank you so much for giving your perspective, such a broad perspective for all of us. And before we end our session, I think we have to take pictures together to make beautiful memories along with Professor Lorraine.